So Ron has been great, and we'd love to have him back. He was a history major at the University of Michigan and graduated from Washington University School of Medicine. He served as an orthopedic surgeon in Vietnam. After holding faculty positions at Washington University, Vanderbilt University, and Albert Einstein College of Medicine, he retired to Wayland, Mass., where he has been living. He has many other positive attributes, which I won't take up the time, but please join me in welcoming Ron Rosenthal.
Thank you, sir. Well, thank you, Phil, and thank you all. A nice turnout on a beautiful day. I noticed that the advance announcement for this meeting said that in case of inclement weather, please call the library first. I live in Wayland. Wayland Public Library is still closed. It still looks like a castle surrounded by a moat. The moat used to be the parking lot, of course. We're just now beginning to dry out. The Russo-Japanese War, much photographed, much reported, but very little studied. Several of you have already asked me, when was the Russo-Japanese War? We don't know much about it. It was the seminal catastrophe, if you will, of the 20th century. It introduced the 20th century as brutally as anything possibly could. 1904, February beginning. The climactic battle was Tsushima, the end of May 1905. On the modern Gregorian calendar, the Russians used the old Julian calendar. Their calendars are about 2 weeks behind. There are two empires, Russian and Japanese, both looking to expand in Asia, and indeed both spoiling for a fight. Late 19th century Russia, early 20th century Russia, an absolute monarchy, ruled by this absolute monarch, weak-willed, stupid, prejudiced, and yet a belief that he had been truly sent by God. It's tough to argue or deal with somebody with that mindset, with all of those wonderful attributes that were Nicholas II, whom some of his survivors and successors are even now thinking of trying to canonize. Good luck to them. Russia is being dragged kicking and screaming into the 20th century, kicking and screaming into the Industrial Revolution, with all of the problems that go with that, labor strife, unrest, a polyglot empire occupying a huge corner of the world, the largest nation on earth by far and away, a corrupt, unmanageable government led by this weak-willed individual. One of Russia's ablest statesmen, a man named Sergius Witte, W-I-T-T-E, said of his own government, quote, "This insane regime, this tangle of corruption, cowardice, craftiness, incompetence, and stupidity," unquote. That is a man describing his own government. Before we go farther, I must make a disclaimer. All of the proper names that we're going to be talking about are either Russian names or Japanese names, meaning they are transliterated into English from either the Cyrillic Russian or the Japanese script. I don't speak either of these two languages, and I do not guarantee my pronunciation. Or indeed, the spelling varies depending on which book you happen to read. Now, Russia has been a naval power since the time of Peter the Great, who went to Holland to study shipbuilding and decreed it to be a great naval power and built ships, and the Russians have been doing that all along. The American Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan, who wrote at the end of the 19th century about sea power, and said, among other things, that a great nation must have a great navy. And so the Russians, like the Germans, Japanese, and the French, and the Americans, all started building great navies, or at least big navies. By 1904, the Russian Navy was the third largest in the world in total number of ships. It was the largest in the world in the number of admirals it had, some of whom had not been to sea in 10 years, some of whom had never been to sea, many of whom were related to the vast Romanov Empire that ruled the nation. Russia didn't need that fleet. The Russian Empire was built by hooves, not by sails, and it was held together by bayonets, not by anchors, unlike the British Empire. Had not fought a major naval battle since 1823, which was the Battle of Navarino off the Black Sea, and dismal performance of what was left of it in the Crimean War in the middle of the 19th century. Some modern building had begun by the Russian Navy. They understood by the turn of the 19th century there was this new hostile power in Japan was going to thwart their expansion in the east. So they began building new ships with, by latest technology and so forth. This is one of their latest battleships. It is identified as a Russian ship by the tall funnels, which are painted yellow with black. Now, the Russians didn't know it, but in the visual scheme of things, the most obvious contrast is between yellow and black, the most visible contrast. And you can see the funnels are. At her foredeck looks like a Union Jack. This is not a British ship. This is the Russian battleship Borodino, and the Union Jack, as you know, is a union of the St. Andrew's Cross, which was the Russians' patron saint, and the St. George's Cross. But that is supposed to be a St. Andrew's Cross, and I'm not sure why it looks like a Union Jack, but it does. It's not. Nonetheless, these ships are being built slowly. Russia had a major shipbuilding presence and could build dreadnoughts one after the other, or not dreadnoughts, battleships one after the other, but rife with corruption, incompetence. The ships were not well built. Sabotage from disgruntled revolutionary workers. They took much longer to build. They never came out the way they were supposed to. They were prone to mechanical breakdowns and so forth. The Russians had 3 fleets. Pacific Fleet based at Port Arthur off the coast of Manchuria. The Atlantic Fleet or Baltic Fleet based in Kronstadt off the coast of Riga, what is modern-day Latvia, and the Black Sea Fleet based in Sevastopol and Odessa. The Black Sea Fleet could be discounted because it can't get out of the Black Sea. The Straits of Dardanelles, by international treaty, were declared no warship can pass through the Straits of Dardanelles, and to enforce this, the Turks had built fairly heavy batteries lining the entire straits. No ship could get in or out of the Black Sea if the Turks didn't want it to, and that is actually true today as well. Well, across on the other side of the ocean, Japan, this is Emperor Meiji. The Meiji Restoration had brought Japan, not kicking and screaming, but willingly, into the 20th century and into the Industrial Revolution. They built an army, they built a navy, they built an industrial plant. They sent their soldiers to France and to Germany to learn the latest techniques. They sent their sailors or their officers to Britain to learn the latest techniques from the British. They formed an alliance with Britain in 1902. This was strictly aimed at Russia because the British and the Russians were also conflicting over the East, over Asia primarily, over a country that we've never heard of. It's called Afghanistan. By 1900, the Japanese were getting 1 or 2 battleships every year, all of them built in England. Eventually, they would get 6 by the time of the outbreak of the war. Some of their heavy cruisers came from Britain, some came from Italy, and they bought 5 brand new submarines from the only nation in the world that built them, and that was the United States. They improved their technology and perfected it, and particularly their artillery. They discovered a new explosive called shimos, named after the Japanese chemist who invented it. Shimos is picric acid. Those of you who are chemists know that picric acid is a cousin of TNT. It's trinitrophenol as opposed to TNT, which is trinitrotoluene. Won't go into the chemistry. It exploded more readily, it exploded more powerfully, and it generated much more heat. So not only would it blow everything apart, but when it didn't blow apart, it set on fire. Unfortunately, it was highly corrosive and it was highly unstable. Only the big guns could have it. The Russians had nothing like it, and indeed the Japanese kept this quite secret. The Russians found it out to their surprise the first time the Japanese started shooting it at them. Constant training and practice on their ships. Trained British officers. This is the Japanese battleship Mikasa. It would become the flagship of Togo's fleet. This is the most modern ship in the world at the time. She was built in a British shipyard, and you can see the funnels are a little smaller than they are on the Russian ships, but the basic outline is the same. 4 12-inch guns, that's her main battery, 8-inch turrets, and 6-inch guns coming out of the side. The leader of the Japanese fleet was Hyakiro Togo, an aristocrat from an aristocratic family, had studied in England, became the leader, worked his way up through the ranks, a man of considerable talent and some international disrepute for involving the sinking of a British transport during the Japanese War of 1894. But Japan needs to expand. They need to expand rapidly. There are no natural resources on the Japanese homeland except coal, pearls, and rice, and some tea. Everything else Japanese have to export. In that way, Japan is very much like Great Britain. They don't grow a whole hell of a lot. They've got to import it all. But the Japanese needed war materials. They did have coal, but they wanted more. They did not have iron. They needed that. And the place to look for it, they decided, was Manchuria. Manchuria is on the other side of the Sea of Japan. Korea is in the way, but the Japanese had a protectorate over Korea, and Korea was basically a weak state. They knew that if they wanted Manchuria, all they had to do was go through Korea, or they could go around through the Yellow Sea, landing just north of the Yalu River. The Russians wanted the same thing. They wanted Manchuria too. They wanted to expand. They needed another freshwater port like Port Arthur, which you can see on the very tip of the Dalny Peninsula. That was the only major port the Russians had in the Pacific that was ice-free. And Russia, given her location, her quest for ice-free ports has existed since the time of Peter the Great and continues to exist to this day. The climate has not changed that much. The Russians would also like a commercial presence in Korea as well as a commercial presence in Manchuria as well. Now, both of them realized that they were going to clash over Manchuria, and they both were looking forward to it. Both sides are spoiling with a fight. The Russians look to a short, victorious little foreign war to unite the country. Have we heard that before? Anywhere recently, years ago? The Spanish-American War, which of course we won, was described as a, quote, splendid little war, unquote. Other attempts to do that, of which we are all too sadly familiar. The Russians shared the existing contempt of the Westerners for Japan. This is a Russian cartoon showing the caricature of the Japanese on a sinking ship, and the Russian basically tweaking his nose, pinching his cheek, boxing his ear, punching in the mouth with a big smile on his face. So that is the prevailing attitude of the Western world, not just the Russians, but the Americans as well, and everybody else in Europe, toward Asian people, toward the Japanese in particular. The Russians began building up their army in Manchuria and their navy, sending their best units to Port Arthur, but keeping some back in Kronstadt as well. The Japanese simply wanted to demonstrate their new military prowess, which they had used against China. And they wanted to show that they could do it against a Western power. The Japanese, like the Russians, had contempt for their enemy. Never underestimate your enemy is supposedly a rule of war. But the Japanese had contempt for the Westerners, and the Russians in particular. One, they were unwashed, they smelled bad, the Japanese are fastidiously clean, and they had no culture, etc., etc., etc. There was no considerable racist prejudice on both sides during the time of the early part of the 20th century. So they're doing the same thing. They're building up their army, but not in Manchuria. They're building the army up in Japan itself for transport to Manchuria. They are developing a fleet of transports, and they're concentrating their navy in the Sea of Japan. On the lower portion is the Sasebo, which they were building up as a naval base. Remember, their entire fleet had been built elsewhere, and they are coming to the conclusion that, no, wait a minute, we can't keep doing that. We got to start building these ourselves. Well, the Russians understand that there's going to be a war, and they will simply overwhelm the Japanese by weight of numbers, which they could do, at least on paper, and that their army and their navy both outgunned and outnumbered the Japanese. And that would end Japanese expansionism. It would allow Russia to consolidate her gains in Manchuria and even establish economic ties in Korea, which the Russians were looking for. The Japanese, on the other hand, a little different strategy. They knew the Russians were more numerous. Their strategy was a quick attack to destroy the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. Then, with the Russian fleet disabled, send their troops across the Sea of Japan to Korea and Manchuria, consolidate their gains in Manchuria, lay siege to Port Arthur, and then talk about peace. Talk about a negotiated peace. Does this sound familiar? Summer 1941. Same thing. Knock out this time it's the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, allowing them to consolidate their gains to, with impunity, bring their troops, this time to Southeast Asia, and consolidate their gains, and then basically the Americans would sue for peace. Well, the exit strategy, if you will, as you can see, is a little vague, but that was basically what they had in mind. So that on February 8th, 1904, the Japanese suddenly attack the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. Now, the Russian fleet is both in and out of the harbor. Port Arthur is a poor base. It's shallow. In order to get to the outer roadstead, the ships have to pass single file over a sandbar. It took a whole day to get the whole fleet in and out because they had to wait for high tide. This was not an ideal harbor, but it's the best the Russians had. So the Japanese send, under cover of night, a torpedo boat squadron. The Japanese had worked hard on the newly invented self-propelled torpedo and had made many improvements on it to attack the Russian fleet outside the roadstead. And they aimed at the big battleships. This is one. This happens to be called the Retvizan, one of the prides of the Russian Pacific Fleet. It was pride not only because it was a new ship and a big ship, but it was a good ship. It was not built in Russia. It was built in Philadelphia. In fact, the building of the Retvizan by the private shipyard in Philadelphia caused consternation among American naval authorities who realized, hey, the Russians are building this brand new battleship, and look what it's got. It's got this. It's going to do that. It's going to be this fast. We need to change the designs of our upcoming battleships, which they did. One of those changes in design was to make them bigger. One of the consequences of that was to make the Panama Canal, then a building, bigger to its present width of 110 feet. Well, the Retvizan is outside the harbor. It's sunk. One of the other ships, called the Tsarevich, built in France, is also sunk. One other Russian-built battleship is also sunk. 3 ships are sunk. That's all. The rest of the fleet isn't touched. These ships are sunk in shallow water. They would all be raised, and they would all fight again. So, goal number 1, deliver a knockout blow against the Russian fleet, has failed. Does that sound familiar? That sounds something like December 7, 1941? History tends to repeat itself. But the fleet's not destroyed, but it's immobilized, and the Japanese do get their army across the sea. They get into Korea, they get into Manchuria, and they begin to expand into Manchuria. They are already thinking in terms of a negotiated peace and decide that maybe the best way to do it is through a disinterested third party. Well, there's no such thing as a disinterested third party. They send one of their best English-speaking aristocrats, a man named Baron Koneko, who just happened to graduate from Harvard College at the same time as the American president, Theodore Roosevelt. They send him to Washington, and he enters into quiet talks with Roosevelt and with his Secretary of War, John Hay. Would the United States be willing to mediate should things come to that, et cetera, et cetera? The Americans, of course, are non-committal. The Americans, like the British, like the French even, who are allied with Russia, like the Germans, all expected a short war. The Japanese to be victorious. TR predicted it would be 10 months. Nobody liked the Russians. This is February 1904. The infamous Kishinev pogroms were November 1903. The British referred to the Tsar as a common murderer. An American Jewish delegation came to Roosevelt and said, we want you to send this letter to the Tsar, which Roosevelt agreed to do. The Tsar refused, of course, to accept it. Russia was held in extremely low opinion in most of the Western countries at this particular point in time. Everybody expected and would cheer a Japanese victory. You know, here's our pupil, look how well he's doing. This is February 1904. This attitude, of course, does not continue. Well, the Russians stay behind their harbor, but not for long. While they are fixing this, the American president is supposedly not interested, but as we know from his writings and his biographies, he's very interested. The Russians mobilize their nation for war. There's great popularity for the war inside of Russia. This is the Romanov coat of arms. Like the Habsburgs, 2 eagles. I'm not sure the significance of that. The Navy is popular, parades in the streets, flag waving, etc., 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 etc. But they do send out a highly competent sailor, a man named Stepan Makarov, to the Far East, and he energized the Russian fleet. And the fleet starts coming out and harassing the Japanese, who are basically staying just out of range of the shore batteries, waiting for a chance to engage the Russian fleet. And Makarov is going to do this. The first time he goes out, though, on the way back, his flagship hits a mine, blows up, sinks with him and everybody else on board. End of Makarov. The Russian Navy never recovers from his death. From then on, the Russians will adopt a passive attitude in Port Arthur. Somewhere around now, April, May 1904, the Russians get the idea, let's reinforce the Pacific Squadron. They had been building battleships since 1900, and all the shipyards are in the Baltic. And some of these were nearing completion. There would be 5 of them eventually. 4 would be completed by October 1904. And these were modern ships. Here's one of them, being the one we saw before, being launched again with what looks like a Union Jack at its bow. But this took place in Russia, and this is a Russian ship. It's called the Borodino, and they're launching it, and there are the flags and all this. Let's send the squadron out to rescue the Far East Fleet. And little by little, the idea gains credence. It's a great idea. We'll send the rest of our Navy out there. We will sweep the Japanese from the sea. And so it begins to come together. The ships are rushed to completion. Mistake, because they were never completed properly. A new commander is appointed, a man named Zinovy Rojdestvensky, and this is how they're going to go. They're going to start on the Baltic at Libau, which is just below Kronstadt, and they're going to go halfway around the world. This had never been done before. Not by a fleet, certainly not by a fleet that had to rely on coal for its fuel. New commander is a well-respected admiral named Rojdestvensky. Reasonable pronunciation, I think. And he's responsible for putting this fleet together. There weren't enough trained sailors, therefore landsmen, peasants were basically conscripted from their huts. What the British called the press gang 100 years before, the Russians were now using. They were sweeping the bottom of the jails in St. Petersburg. Every officer that could be found that couldn't run away was placed on board. The ships did not have properly trained crews, and the ships themselves were not properly built. Corruption and cutting corners had led to them being heavily overweight, so overweight that when they finally were launched and completed, they drew too much water, much more than they had been designed for, so that their armor belt was below the waterline, where it really didn't do any good. And this was true of all the new ones. And they're going halfway around the world. And they're taking a lot of older ships with them. And they're going to need coal, and there are no friendly ports along the way. Remember, a quarter of the world at this point in time is owned by the British. They're in alliance with the Japanese. They are not going to help the Russians in any way, shape, or form. But the ships are delayed. Eventually, they're going to leave in June, then in July, then in August. By royal decree, they must leave in October, and so they do. A few of the ships had undergone trial runs, very disappointing. Many things needed to be corrected. The ships didn't know how to maneuver with each other. They're all green crews. Nobody had been to sea. And of course, there hadn't been a major Russian naval engagement in 90 years. So nobody remembered that whatsoever. The fleet leaves Libau and Kronstadt, and it's blessed by this man, and we throw him in because this is one of the significant figures in Russian history. His name is Konstantin Pobyedonostsev. He was the minister of Nicholas's father, Alexander III. It was Pobyedonostsev who enunciated the Russian policy of dealing with minorities, herd them into areas where they can't leave from, Russify them by direct order. The idea being, and force them to convert. 1/3 will convert, he thought, 1/3 will emigrate, 1/3 will die. It was this action that provoked the great immigration to the United States from Eastern Europe, which would reach its peak in 1907. Well, Nicholas kept Pobyedonostsev on. By now he's an old man. He was a priest. Quote, remember, Tsarist Russia is a theocracy. And he had the title of Procurator of the Holy Synod. Only the Russians could think up something like that. He personally blesses the fleet along with the Tsar. The fleet goes on its way. One ship runs aground on its way out. Not an auspicious beginning. An incredible aura of gloom and doom aboard the fleet. Nobody expected them to much less get to their destination and even to be successful getting there. But lots of press there. This is the most reported war in history up until that time. Wherever they go, they would be reported and somebody would write something about it, usually something unfriendly. Meanwhile, back in Manchuria, the Russian fleet is now bottled up at Port Arthur. Makarov is dead. Nonetheless, they are ordered, you got to get out of there and you got to get to Vladivostok, which you can see it pretty much at the dead center of the map. That was the only other Russian port on the west in Siberia, in eastern Russia. Vladivostok was not an ice-free port, and it really wasn't much of a port. At the time, it was little more than an overgrown fishing village. It could not support the Pacific Fleet, but that's where they were going to go. And they're ordered out. On August 10th, 1904, the Russian fleet leaves Port Arthur. Togo and the Japanese are waiting, but they're well out of range, and they do not expect the Russians. The Russians surprise them by leaving the harbor and getting out of the harbor a lot quicker than they had originally, than either the Japanese thought they could do or they thought they could do themselves. Togo's ships are faster. He catches up with the Russians. They start cannonading at long range. It's now around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And they are shooting back and forth, and both sides are receiving casualties. The Russian gunnery is not that bad. The Russians are hitting the Japanese, particularly the flagship, the Mikasa. And they're hitting some of the other Russian ships, and Togo is running low on coal. The Russians, meanwhile, had filled up with enough coal to make it to Vladivostok without having to stop. So they are a little bit overloaded, but they've got the fuel to go there. Just as, according to some accounts, Togo is thinking about breaking off the action so he's got enough fuel to get back home, a couple of hits from one of the Japanese ships hits the Russian flagship, the Tsarevich, the French built pride of the fleet. 3 hits in the conning tower and the bridge, one right after the other. The net result, the conning tower is destroyed and everybody in it, including the admiral, the captain, the chief of staff, all of the leaders of the fleet are all there, and they're all killed at once. And the helmsman, as he's killed, falls over the wheel and the ship begins to turn. Eventually will make a 180-degree circle before they can get it back under control. It's the leader of the fleet. The rest of the fleet follows. Even though they know they were supposed to go to Vladivostok, they follow, they think, he's changed his mind. Very poor signaling. The Russians were extremely poor at communicating with each other, with flags or what have you. Radio was still a little too new to be able to be used reliably. This is 1904. The end result, the flagship itself, the Tsarevich, is damaged sufficiently, primarily in the funnels. And damage to the funnels meant that the ship would begin to use much greater quantities of coal, killed the fuel efficiency of the furnaces, and many other shots as well. It eventually limps into the neutral port of Qingdao, which the Germans owned, and it's disarmed by the Germans, and the guys standing around it on the shore with pith helmets are Germans. The rest of the fleet limps back into Port Arthur. It's coming. Night is coming. Togo does not pursue because he's running out of coal and he's running out of light. So the fleet makes it back into Port Arthur. They have some damage, not terribly severe, but the reality is from that point on, August 10th, 1904 on, the Russian fleet never leaves Port Arthur. It will never leave again, and the ships will never fire again big guns at Japanese ships. Little by little, the guns that can be dismounted are taken off and brought on land for defending Port Arthur, and the crews, little by little, are taken off the ships. The Russian fleet is now a fleet in being. But it is still a fleet, and the Japanese must continue to watch it. It's now August. The Japanese know, everybody knows, the Russians are building this great fleet in the Baltic that is going to sail. And it does sail in October, and by the time the Russians sail from Port Arthur, from the Baltic, by the time Rozhestvensky gets underway, the Japanese understand. The Russian fleet in the Pacific must be destroyed. It cannot be allowed to exist. Togo cannot meet any fleet coming out of Port Arthur with any fleet coming, even if it's coming halfway around the world. he will be outnumbered 3-4 to 1. So, Japanese strategic and tactical goal becomes the destruction of the Russian fleet. The Japanese can't sail into Port Arthur and destroy it. They'll run aground. The only way it can be destroyed is by gunfire from the hills surrounding Port Arthur. So, while the Russian fleet is sitting there doing nothing, the Japanese are attacking Port Arthur with great vigor and with enormous casualties. The Russians have machine guns. They have entrenched breastworks. The Japanese attack these wave after wave of suicidal squadron. They will eventually lose some 40,000 men before the hills are conquered. And the final hill, 203-meter hill, because that's its height, once that's captured by the Japanese, that hill has a commanding view of the entire harbor and the entire city. The next day, the Japanese wrestle up these 11-inch siege guns, courtesy Krupp Works, and begin basically target practice at the ships in the harbor. Within a week, every ship in the harbor is sunk. Shells are beginning to rain down on Port Arthur. The fall of Port Arthur is only a matter of time. But with the destruction of the Pacific Fleet, now and only now can Togo take his ships back to Japan, where they are in desperate need of a refit. Gun barrels have to be re-rifled, ships have to be painted, bottoms have to be scraped, boilers have to be cleaned, crews have to be given some rest and relaxation, more practice, more shells, more ammunition. This will take a couple of months. The Russians know this. Rojestvensky, who is now coming down the coast of Africa, realizes he's got to get to the Pacific before the Japanese can complete the refit of their very compact navy. The Japanese had started the war with 6 battleships. They would lose 2 to the minefields, the same minefield that killed Admiral Makarov, knocked out 2 Japanese battleships, one in full view of the Russians, the other was damaged and sunk later out of sight. The Russians always believed that the Japanese had 5 battleships. They only had 4. The Japanese then, as later, were a little bit reluctant to completely discuss their losses. This is an overwrought Japanese picture of the Russian fleet sinking at Port Arthur. It didn't sink this way. It sunk the way the ship in the background is, that's sitting on the bottom. It's a shallow harbor. They didn't sink nose first or tail first. They settled in the harbor. Just as, no difference. They're ineffective. They are sunk. They are destroyed. Most of their crews are killed. Meanwhile, Rojestvensky is in Tangier. He's on his way south. The squadron didn't really look like this. Here they are actually on maneuvers just before they left with flags flying and so forth. But you can see, again, high silhouettes, very visible funnels. The funnels were extremely vulnerable, as we've seen, even with just a couple of holes in its funnels. The Tsarevich could not finish its journey, and these ships, these funnels are bigger, because there are only 2 of them. The Tsarevich had 3. And they are vulnerable. Now, this is a proud picture, but that does not tell you exactly what the Japanese ships look like. In Tangier, just below Gibraltar, the fleet splits. Rojestvensky sent his second in command, a man named von Felkersham, with a smaller detachment through the Suez Canal. They will meet in Madagascar, down by the South African coast. Rojestvensky continues down the coast in a true voyage of the damned. They're going into progressively tropical waters. They are running out of things like soap and fresh food. They are in hostile territory, and there's no place where they can coal. They must bring their colliers with them. They had contracted for a fleet of German colliers to follow them along, and they would coal at sea. A miserable process. The ships kept breaking down. They kept going more slowly. Rojestvensky is progressively becoming more and more irascible, more and more unhinged. If you like him, you say that he was buckling under the incredible pressure. If you don't like him, you're saying he was going crazy. And if you read enough accounts of the battle of the Russo-Japanese War, there are these 2 views about this most interesting fellow. They finally do arrive on Madagascar on December 16th. 2 days before December 14th, 203-meter hill had fallen. 1 week later, the entire Russian fleet at Port Arthur will be destroyed. December 31st or January 1st, Port Arthur itself capitulates. This news is flashed around the world. The Russians at Madagascar know it. What's he going to do now? Where's he going to go? Where can he go? He can't go too many places. The only place left for him now is Vladivostok. Either that or turn around. And many of his officers and many of the officers in the Admiralty at St. Petersburg advise that, this isn't going to work, guys. Let's get them back. We can still use them as bargaining chips or what have you. The Tsar would have none of it. Not only does the fleet go on, but someone in staff officers in St. Petersburg get the bright idea of reinforcing it. Now, the Baltic Fleet and the Pacific Fleet together had virtually every modern warship the Russians owned. But they're going to reinforce the Baltic Fleet by putting together another fleet, which they call the 3rd Pacific Squadron, of basically everything that the Russians owned that floated, even some ships that were 40 years old. They were not only useless, but absolutely dangerous. 8 knots, 10 knots was the most they could do. The Japanese could do 18 if they really had to. The Russians never moved any faster than 10 or 12 knots at the absolute maximum. Their ships were designed to go 18 knots, they never did. Rozhestvensky violently opposes this. It's a terribly bad idea. It will slow him down. These old ships, the Japanese are not going to shoot at the old ships. They're going to ignore them. They're going to shoot at the ones that can effectively shoot back at them. It's extra mouths to feed, and delay in waiting for them to come will give the Japanese more time to refit their ships. Nonetheless, they go February 1st. They leave commanded by a man named Nikolai Nebogatov, who Rozhestvensky doesn't like. It turns out Rozhestvensky doesn't like most anybody. Von Felkersham, his second in command, was one of the few senior Russian officers whom he did like or he knew from the old Naval Academy days. And now he is sure that there are Japanese spies everywhere. The Japanese were very good at creating fear and distrust. There were terrorists, there were Japanese spies everywhere. Every ship, every boat was a Japanese ship. On the way out of the Baltic through the English Channel in October 1904, the Russians had blundered into the English fishing fleet and had shot it up, believing them to be Japanese gunboats. Well, the Japanese had no gunboat this side of the Yellow Sea. It created an incredible international incident, as you may guess. The Russians paid big-time reparations to the British, but the fleet continued on. And that the Japanese main body would appear anywhere in the Indian Ocean. No, Togo is still at Sasebo. He is still refitting his ships at breakneck pace as fast as he can, because everybody knows the Russians are coming. Well, the Russians leave Madagascar. The Tsar is finally convinced, let the fleet leave Madagascar. Don't let them sit there. It's a most unhealthy place. And Nebogatov will meet him up rather than in Madagascar, but somewhere else to be determined later. Rozhestvensky disappears. He disappears into the Indian Ocean with his ships, and by a really superb feat of navigation, they negotiate the entire Indian Ocean, which is a little over 2,000 miles, and they are not seen again until they're off the coast of Singapore. Right here. They're going to Indochina. The French own Indochina. The French are sort of friendly, although they're under great pressure from the Germans, the British, the Japanese to maintain strict neutrality, not allow ships of a warring vessel, of a warring nation, to stay in their harbors any more than 24 hours. They look the other way as much as they can. And Rozhestvensky will end up in Kamran Bay, a wide bay, rather pretty, and far away from any telegraph lines. Meanwhile, once he's sighted off of Singapore, all the world knows where he is. He had disappeared, and now he's reappeared. Now, Bogatov knows where he is. He will eventually find him off the coast of Indochina. They will meet off of Indochina. They'll meet off Kamran Bay. They will talk for about a half hour, and that's all. And there's no further meeting ever between the two of them. Nabokov does not know what Rozhestvensky's tactics is. Rozhestvensky is telling no one. He trusts absolutely no one, or maybe he hasn't made up his mind. We don't know. He didn't leave any memoirs. So much of it is speculation. And so, after one attempt to try to break out before Nabokov got there, the ship's coal, they take on enough coal to get them to Vladivostok, and this, of course, again, further overloads them. Again, their armor belts are underwater, all the major ships. They're going slowly, and there's coal and coal dust everywhere. Kamran Bay, at the time they were there, which is April, is a very pleasant place, at least weather-wise, and they're on their way. They're going north into the Yellow Sea, and they're going to aim to Vladivostok. And how are they going to go there? There are a couple of different ways to go, and we'll take a break for about 5-10 minutes, please. Let's limit it just draining off the coffee we just had, and then we'll reassemble and we'll finish, and we will send them on their way. Admiral Felkersham and Admiral Nabokov as they leave Kamran Bay.
Did you want that on, Ron?
Oh, I don't care. I don't care. As long as I can be recorded. They are leaving Kamran Bay. I can tell you a personal experience. Kamran Bay is where I saw the Republic of Vietnam for the first time. It's a very pretty place, and under different circumstances, it might have been very pleasant. But he's leaving Kamran Bay, and it's not quite on this map, but now he has to decide he's going to Vladivostok, and how's he going to get there? Well, there aren't a lot of ways to get there. Japan's kind of in the way. So the way he picked was the most direct way between Korea and Japan, and there between Korea and Japan is the island of Tsushima, and he's going to go to the east, where the water is deeper and the channel is a little bit wider. Absolute radio silence, which was easy to do because radios weren't terribly reliable then anyway, and mist and fog, and Togo does not know where he's going. Togo knows he's coming, but he's not sure which way, and he's got to guard every which way, including the northern one, north of the island of Honshu, just before where Sapporo is. He can come through a narrow strait, La Perouse, and that's a straight shot to Vladivostok, but that's in the middle of the Japanese homelands. If any of his ships get disabled doing that, they're lost. There's no way he can save any of them. So he picks the Korean Strait. Togo is meanwhile waiting. He moves his ships from Sasebo to Masampo, and you can't see it, but it's on the southeast coast of Korea. It's near where Busan is, and anybody that lived through the Korean War knows that Busan is right somewhere around here. Pardon? A mouse?
I have a mouse here.
Okay.
It might work. I don't know.
Let me see.
Let's see if it works. There it is. Can you see it up there? Yeah. And you can
Oh,
see it
excellent.
on the screen. You see it on the screen?
Yeah, come here, you.
Right
There you
here.
go. Yep, right there.
This screen. Right there. You can point to it.
Okay. He's down here. Rozhestvensky is coming this way. He sends his auxiliaries, his hospital ship, his transports, his colliers, who are faithfully accompanying him to Shanghai. That's the first hint that Togo has of where the Russians are going. They're sending their auxiliaries off, meaning that they're expecting battle soon. That means they have to be coming through here, and they're coming through here. A Japanese picket ship picks up a Russian hospital ship at the tail end of the line at night when all the Russian ships are blacked out except the hospital ship, which decided they're too far away, nobody's going to care. Japanese pick them up. All of a sudden the Russians hear an incredible increase in Japanese radio traffic, and one officer turns to the admiral and says, "They have found us," which is the case. Now Togo knows where they are, and he leaves Masampo down here in Korea, and he's going to meet them, and they're going to meet somewhere around here. The Russians, meanwhile, are in 3 columns, and Rozhestvensky is trying to think which way to reorganize his fleet for the best way, because he knows the Japanese are going to find him. And he doesn't know what their column will be, what their line will be either. Togo is standing on the bridge of the Mikasa. There he is in the lower right-hand corner. This is, as you might guess, a Japanese picture. And how do we recognize it as a Japanese picture? There's something in all the Japanese paintings and drawings that looks very carefully. The Oriental Asian eyes are depicted as being Western. None of them have that epicanthal fold that so characterizes so many of the Asian races. They all look kind of Western. That's no more, but that was the case in that period of time. So Rozhestvensky realized he's got to reform his fleet, and he makes an attempt to reform it into two columns with his strongest 4 new ships on one side, the other newer battleship that he has leading, some older battleships on the other side, and all the others behind. This is botched. One ship doesn't follow the signals, some of them stop, they're botched up. The Bogatov refers to it later on as a confused mob. And in the middle of this confused mob, way off on the horizon, puffs of black smoke, it's Togo. Togo is in one line, his 4 most powerful ships, and they are powerful ships leading. Behind it are 2 heavy armored cruisers, the 2 ships that the Japanese got from Italy, that were built in Italy. They have 10-inch guns, it's almost equal to the 12-inch guns on the battleships. And his auxiliaries behind, and some of his older ships behind. So the Russians didn't look quite like this. Again, this is a nice painting. It makes a great introductory picture, of course. And this is kind of what they look. And this is what the ship's like now. There is no question who these ships are at the very peak of the foremast. And this, I guess, is the Suvarov. That is the fleet flagship. That is the Cross of St. Andrew, the patron saint of the Russian Navy, and also, as many of you know, the patron saint of Scotland. And here's their position when they meet. The Japanese are here. They're coming southwest. They sight the Russians trying to reorganize. They're not in a complete line yet. The first division are the most powerful ships. And Togo realizes that he's going the wrong way. He can turn and come at the Russians this way, which is what Nelson did at Trafalgar. But then his T, as it were, will be crossed. And while Nelson could do that at Trafalgar, because he came at the French and British in 2, and the French and Spanish in 2 lines, Togo's only got 1. Rather, he attempts this 180-degree turn. That will put his strongest ships parallel to the Russian strongest ships. It will give him a line in line with the Russians. Very, very dangerous. He's within range of the Russian 12-inch guns now. And the Russians are aware of it. He decides to make this turn, what's been called his famous turn at Tsushima, that has long been argued in naval strategy, historical circles, and so forth, understanding that the Russians could put 1 or more of his ships out of commission. Did he think they could do it? Probably. He'd seen the Russian gunnery at the 10th of August and knew the Russians were capable of doing it, but the stakes here were so high, and Togo was a gambler, and so he does it. And up to the masthead of the Mikasa flies a flag that will become famous. It's called the Z or Z flag, and on it is the statement translated variously as, "The rise and fall of the empire depends upon the outcome of today's battle. Let every man do his utmost." A parallel taken from Nelson's famous message at Trafalgar, "England expects every man will do his duty." Well, the Russians see this. Rozhestvensky sees this, and he opens fire. But the Russians have not completed their line either. They are still, some of their ships can't shoot because the other ship's in front of them, and only a few of them can get off a couple of shots. Even so, they hit the Mikasa a couple of times. One shell, which does not explode, lands in Togo's cabin. Another shell that does explode misses him by a couple of feet and explodes behind him. He's nicked in the thigh. It's not one-sided yet. The Russians have found the range very early on. But within 10 minutes, the entire turn is completed. The Japanese are now heading northeast. The Russians are heading northeast. And beginning somewhere around 2 o'clock, depending on whose clock we're looking at, the cannonade begins in earnest with the heavy guns, that is the 12-inch guns of both fleets, shooting at each other. And all you could see is puffs of smoke from each ship moving ahead. For the first half hour, the Russians gave as good as they got. Their marksmanship was not at all bad. They hit the Japanese on several occasions. They did cause damage on the Mikasa. They knocked out the steering gear of one of his cruisers. They caused ultimately about 100 casualties on board the Mikasa, which is 1/7 of her crew. But within a half hour, their shooting went to pieces. The Japanese were shooting back 2 to 3 times the rate of the Russians. Rate of fire becomes one of the many critical factors in the actual Battle of Tsushima. The Japanese outshot the Russians. Not only that, their shells always exploded. The Russians often didn't. Not only that, when their shells exploded, they exploded on contact. Not only did they explode on contact and blow up everything in the area, or everyone, they set everything else on fire. The Russians were unable to bear up under this kind of bombardment, which they had never expected. And within a half hour, although their ships at least were theoretically intact, their marksmanship was over. The Russian contribution to the battle by now is over. The battle is decided within the first 30 minutes. And it was decided by the greater speed of the Japanese ships, the greater efficiency of the Japanese gunner, that is, rate of fire, the greater explosive power of the Japanese shells, and the lesser efficiency of the Russian shells. When they did explode, they were armor-piercing shells that explode inside. You couldn't see the shell explode, even though today it's obvious how much damage the Russians were actually able to do in the first part of the battle. The Japanese advantages are now becoming apparent. Faster ships, better trained crews, better set up ships, better damage control, much better morale. The Russian morale is at rock bottom. All the Russians had was more, but they weren't nearly as efficient. The Japanese also had a well-organized structure of command. The Russians didn't. Something happens to Rozhetsvensky, nobody was sure what would happen next. His brief orders were that if his ship is disabled, the next ship in line would lead the fleet. Not the Admiral Nabokov. His favorite, Admiral Folkersham, had died of a stroke following cancer 1 week before the battle. No one knew this. Folkersham's flag still flew from his flagship, an older ship called the Osliabaya. No one on board the Osliabaya except the captain knew that the Admiral's body rested in a lead-lined coffin under the ship's icon. Unreliable, untrained, mutinous crews, defective ammunition, unfamiliar waters, and yet, the Russians did incredibly well in the Battle of Tsushima, far better than they were expected to do, given all the disadvantages and all of the cards that were stacked against them. Within an hour, the Osliabaya sinks. It's holed from just at the waterline. Remember the armor plate's underwater? And it sinks, turns over in full view of the fleet. First time a battleship had ever been sunk solely by gunfire. About 200 crew are saved. They're rescued by Japanese torpedo boats that are able to pick them up. The Japanese now concentrate their fire on the leader, whoever the leader happens to be. This is the Suvorov. This is Admiral Rozhetsvensky's flag. This is what's left of it after about an hour. The whole ship is on fire, and there's one gun, a 75 millimeter gun near the waterline, that continues to shoot back and would continue to shoot back until the ship itself sunk. One by one, the Japanese pick off the leaders. Remember, the action started about 2 o'clock in the afternoon of a May afternoon when the days are long. By 7 o'clock, there's still enough light left. One by one, the leaders are picked off. The next in line is the Alexander III. It's blown up with no survivors. The next in line is the Borodino. It sinks with 1 survivor. The next in line is the Orel or Oriole, depending on how you pronounce it. It will not sink. It will survive the battle, though heavily damaged. Night falls. The Suvorov, meanwhile, is attacked by Japanese torpedo boats and sinks. The Admiral has been rescued. He's unconscious. He's been wounded a couple of times. Rozhetsvensky is taken off the Suvorov, or actually he is thrown off into a waiting torpedo boat, and which speeds away. But he's unconscious. He is not able to lead the fleet. Finally, Nabokov gets word that he's in charge a torpedo brings him an official order from Rojestvensky. But now it's night. The Japanese main fleet pulls back, send their torpedo boats in to finish off the rest of the Russians with torpedoes. They fail. Torpedo boat tactics had not yet been perfected to that point. The Russians, the remaining Russians, including the old ships of Nabokotov's squadron, can beat them off. Dawn comes, the Russian fleet's widely scattered. They all kind of congregate around Nabokotov. The Japanese surround them. A few Russian ships, meanwhile, on the periphery are able to get away. Eventually, the remaining Russian ships will surrender. Nabokotov will raise first the surrender flag, then the white flag, and then finally the rising sun. The Japanese will take possession of what's left of his fleet. Very few Russian ships will escape. By now, everybody's sunk. They are in uncharted waters, and Nabokotov is surrendered. Little by little, the Russian ships, some of them fight back. They're overwhelmed by Japanese units, and one by one, they are sunk, or they scuttle their ships and they go down with flags flying. When that happened, the crew is almost always lost. The only crews that were saved in the ships that surrendered. Those ships that fought till the end or scuttled themselves, the crews were almost always entirely lost. A few ships get away. 3 will eventually make it to Vladivostok out of a squadron of 38. Several will go for neutral waters where they will be in turn, one coupled at Tsingtao, one to Shanghai, and one, the light cruiser Aurora. This is not the Aurora, this is Nabokotov surrendering his ship. This is taken from a Japanese ship. The light cruiser Aurora will make it to Manila, where she is disarmed by the American authorities. She will eventually make it back to Russia after the war. She will take a part in the revolution when she is over, when her crew mutinies and starts firing guns to signal the beginning of the November Revolution, signal the beginning of the general strike that ultimately toppled the Kerensky government, which had toppled the Tsar's government before him. The Aurora today is moored on the Neva in St. Petersburg at the foot of the old Admiralty building. This picture was made in May 2000. That's kind of what it looks like. It's made into a shrine. Of course, it's been prettied up. All the blood was long since washed away from its decks, the blood and pieces of humanity. You can go on board. Should you visit St. Petersburg, if you do, I suggest you go on board. Get an idea how small this ship really was. This ship also sailed halfway around the world. Five out of 38 Russian ships are either sunk, interned, or captured. 3 make it to Vladivostok. The citizens of Vladivostok are waiting for the mighty fleet to arrive with bands and welcoming, and 3 ships make it in, and gradually the news comes in that the Russian fleet is essentially destroyed. There is no more Russian Pacific Fleet. This is the most one-sided battle in naval history. That includes Trafalgar, that includes Jutland, and that includes Leyte Gulf. The 3 climactic battles of the 3 major wars subsequent and prior to the Russo-Japanese War. The Russians lost all their modern ships except one, the Orel, which was heavily damaged. All of their auxiliaries except 3, which managed to make it to Vladivostok, and 1 or 2 made it back home. The Tsarevich, meanwhile, which is still in Tsingtao after the 10th of August, is repaired and makes it back to Russia, where she is used by the Navy for several years. 5,000 men, Russian sailors, are killed at Tsushima. Most of them drowned in their own ships. Another 6,000 are taken prisoner. Interestingly, the Russian sailors were treated better by their Japanese captors than they were by their own officers on board their own ships. They were fed better and they were treated more humanely. The Japanese, meanwhile, lost 3 small torpedo boats, 117 killed, virtually all of them on board the Mikasa. That's it. The most one-sided naval battle in history. The Japanese, meanwhile, incorporated some of the sunken ships or captured ships into their navy. This is the Retvizan again. Here she is on the mud at Port Arthur. The Japanese raised her, incorporated her into their navy. They incorporated the Nikolai first. That was Nabogotov's flagship. Both of these ships ended up being used as target practice. Perhaps the most ignominious end for a warship that can be imagined. But with the exception of the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian fleet is at the bottom of the ocean, and so are all of its crews. Russia ceases to exist as a naval power, will not become thought of as a naval power until 1945, when at the end of World War II, a couple of people realize, hey, guess what? The Soviets got 400 subs. During the course of the Second World War, the Soviet Union built more submarines than the Germans had, the Japanese had, the Americans had, the British had. Russia became a naval power in 1945. Well, now, what next? The Japanese are unable to continue the war. They're everywhere victorious. They've taken large pieces of Manchurian territory. They do invade the Sakhalin Island, which is Russian, to use that as a bargaining chip. But what's happened to Japan? They're out of men. They're out of money. They're out of credit. And on paper, the Russians are making good their losses in Manchuria. They're sending their European army east in increments to reinforce the army in Manchuria. On paper, on land, Russia is able to continue the war. Russia doesn't need her navy to continue the war. But, January 1905, Bloody Sunday in St. Petersburg, a riot with the troops shooting into an unarmed protest march, revolution breaking out, strikes, sabotage, mutiny. The revolution is spreading. The Tsar doesn't know what to do. He offers some reforms, the temporary Duma or the parliament. But the revolution continues. The revolutionaries were financed by the Japanese. Lenin got Japanese money. Father Gapon, who led the march that turned into Bloody Sunday, although that's not what he meant, had Japanese money. The Japanese spent millions of yen in Russia on sabotage, all of which was apparently money well spent, although they were sowing seeds for a future problem. The Japanese realized it's time for peace. And these plans that they had back in February '04 of using the United States as a mediator now are bearing fruit. They again come to Roosevelt. Would he, in the interest of humanity, invite the Russians to join him, to join the Japanese in a discussion, in an armistice that will be held in some neutral place? He would just be the facilitator. The U.S. would not be involved in the peace talks at all. The Tsar is convinced by the American minister that yes, he must agree to this, so quietly he agrees ahead of time. So when Roosevelt sends his famous telegram to Tokyo and to St. Petersburg, offering his good offices as a mediator in the war, as a facilitator for a peace conference, he knew ahead of time that they both would accept. Well, where's the peace conference supposed to be held? Meanwhile, the Russian Revolution is continuing. November 1905, the Potemkin mutiny will occur, but we're not quite there yet. For various reasons, it's decided to hold the peace process in the United States, it being the least interested of all the, quote, disinterested, unquote, parties in Europe. The Japanese send plenipotentiaries. The Russians send a plenipotentiary. Plenipotentiary is an official who has the power to negotiate treaties by himself. The United States has never had such a thing. By the Constitution, all treaties must be approved by the United States Senate. No such thing as a plenipotentiary from the United States. But other nations have. The Russians and the Japanese did both. And Portsmouth is chosen, and they're going to put them up in this place. Anybody ever been here? This is Wentworth by the Sea, for those of you that have not been there. It's a lovely place, and there are plaques all over the place about the Japanese state here, and this was Count Wittie's room, and so on and so forth. A very idyllic place for people to talk. Roosevelt first has them all meet him on board the Mayflower, his yacht anchored in Long Island Sound off of his home in Sagamore Bay, Sagamore Hill rather, on Oyster Bay. And those of you, if you visit New York, and you are somewhere around Long Island, Suffolk County, go and visit Roosevelt's home in Sagamore Hill. It's well worth the trip. He charms them both, or so he thinks. Remember, Roosevelt, this is August 1905. Theodore Roosevelt has been elected the previous year by a huge plurality. He is, in his own words to his wife, no longer an accident. He is really feeling his oats. And his own personal powers of charm in his own mind are limitless. Well, the Japanese were not quite so conned, and neither were the Russians, but be that as it may, they talk and they talk, and it's obvious there's a sticking point, and the sticking point is reparations. The Japanese want a huge war indemnity, basically to pay for the war. The Russians are saying, we are not paying one penny. And this appears to be irreconcilable point, and the conference is about to break up when TR intervenes personally, pulling the Russians aside and said, you got to go easy on the indemnity. Offered to buy back the lower half of Sakhalin Island for however many million dollars. That'll at least be a sop to the Japanese. And he goes to the Japanese and says, you guys cannot continue to ask for an indemnity, or we, meaning us, the British, the French, the Germans, will not support you. Support you means lend you more money. The Japanese are stuck. They're up against the wall. The Russians may suspect this, but they don't really know. The Japanese drop their demand for an indemnity. The Russians don't say anything about buying Sakhalin Island. The Japanese offer it to them. The peace is concluded in September 1905. And if you want to go up to Portsmouth and visit the Portsmouth Naval Yard, there's a plaque showing where the peace was actually signed. Understand this, the Peace of Portsmouth was not a negotiated peace, it was a dictated peace. The Japanese understood this. The Russians, of course, came off very well. They lost everything militarily, and yet they came off with losing half of Sakhalin Island. They lost Port Arthur, but they lost that anyway, and nothing else. Because of the actions of the American president, who had great prestige at the time. He would be later awarded the Nobel Prize. Here he is with Count Witte is on the extreme left. You notice Witte is a head taller than Roosevelt. Roosevelt is a head taller than the Japanese emissaries. Roosevelt was rarely photographed standing with people next to him who were taller than he, and that was a lot of humanity. He was not a particularly tall man, and he wished to not necessarily publicize this. Togo and the Japanese leaders are given a hero's welcome, needless to say. Back in Japan, here is his victory parade. The U.S. is now a major power. The Japanese understand they have to build their navy. They cannot rely on anybody else anymore. Another overwrought cartoon. There's Theodore Roosevelt bringing the two of them together. Let us have peace. Who said that? That's a quote from U.S. Grant. His final words were, let us have peace. And here he is. For this he wins the Nobel Prize. But did he deserve the Nobel Prize for peace? No, he did not. He stopped the war. But by the way he stopped the war was the sowing of dragon's teeth. The Japanese understood from then on that they had one growing enemy for them in Asia, and that was the United States. And the Japanese never forgot this, and the rest of their policy from then on, through the end of 1945, was directed at hostility to the United States, as the United States being their major enemy. Well, the U.S. is aware of this. The Potemkin, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, mutinies. This is November 1905. The crew, depending on whether you read or ever saw Sergei Eisenstein's Soviet-era movie of 1925, which showed sailors being herded below and mowed down by machine gun fire. That did not happen. But nonetheless, the ship mutinied. Further examples of the Russian Revolution. With the end of the war came the end of the Russian Revolution. The Russian army remained loyal to the crown, which it would not do in 1917. But the coming of peace, the end of the war, allowed the army to help quell the revolution. The revolution was never completely quelled. The Duma was short-lived. The Russian reforms were short-lived. The revolution would would seethe and simmer, and of course rise up again in 1917. Some brief attempts at rapprochement were made, and the lessons of the war were much studied, and some were of course obvious. The tactics of the war were misinterpreted. The Japanese won their battles on war against the hills by suicide attacks. They were willing to accept hundreds of thousands of casualties. The planners of the war in France and Britain particularly realized that this could be done as well. And so in the early days of World War I, the French and later the British adopted tactics mass infantry against entrenchments, with the result that they were mowed down by the hundreds of thousands. Half of the French casualties in World War II occurred in the first 6 months of the war. This is a drawing of French soldiers attacking on the Marne, the same thing. This is 2 years after the outbreak of war. The United States is now recognized as a world power. To demonstrate this, Roosevelt sends what would be called the Great White Fleet around the world. It leaves in 2006, comes back in the end of February 2009, a couple of weeks before he leaves office. It's a very impressive fleet, 20 battleships, the entire United States battle fleet. Of course, by the time these ships sailed from Washington, which is where they left, every single one of them was obsolete. The British had launched HMS Dreadnought, based partly on the lessons of Tsushima. Heavy guns, speed were critical. Heavy guns, speed, rate of fire. Dreadnought was going to do all this. She was faster, bigger, had more heavy guns, no light guns other than very small guns, and gave her name to a whole class of ships that other navies emulated and began building rapidly, and the naval arms race began in earnest with the launching of HMS Dreadnought, which made all the navies in the world, including the British, obsolete. The two-ocean principle became basic American policy. The Panama Canal is rushed into completion, big enough to accommodate the largest vessels in the U.S. Navy and the largest vessels that were still being dreamed of. And indeed, it's just being widened now by the Panamanians, and nobody knows how that's going to go. There were some brief attempts of reconciliation between the Japanese and the Russians in 1906, 1907 to try and develop combined commercial interests in Manchuria. Neither side really was particularly interested in this. It failed. And from then on till 1945, the Japanese and the Russians maintained, not just suspicion, but outright hostility toward each other. In Manchuria in 1939, the Russians and Japanese would clash. The Russians sent 270,000 men to the Amur River. They sent their latest Air Force, including 4-engine bombers, 1939. Eventually, a peace is signed September 1939. For the rest of the war, the Japanese and the Russians glared at each other over the Amur River. During World War II, Stalin maintained a strict neutrality regarding the Japanese. Stalin was afraid of the Japanese, just as the Japanese were afraid of him. Fear of each other out of all proportion to reality. June 1941, so the Nazis invade Russia. Capture Soviet armies by the hundreds of thousands, make it to the gates of Moscow. They cannot be stopped. There's one remaining Russian army, and that's the Siberian army, and Stalin holds them in Siberia through all the summer and fall of 1941 because he's afraid of a Japanese attack. Only when his spies in Tokyo, his German spies as it were, as the man was a German communist, assure him that the Japanese buildup, which occurred in the summer of 1941, was aimed at Southeast Asia and not at Stalin. Then and only then did he release the Siberian army. When the Germans encountered them at the gates of Moscow, the Germans were stopped at the gates of Moscow, as we know, in December 1941. Some of it was by these guys. These are some of the few Siberian troops that were captured alive. Most of them never made it alive. And the Germans realized that this is an entirely new army. Where the hell did they come from? Well, they came from Siberia, then and only then. Nonetheless, even with this, April 1942, a Doolittle raider lands in Russia. The Russians are our friends. No, they're not. The crew is interned. They're treated like prisoners of war. The airplane is confiscated. They sit out the war in Russia. November 1944, a B-29 disabled over Japan, makes it to Russia, lands in Siberia. Same thing. The crew is interned. The airplane disappears. The Russians took the B-29 apart, piece by piece, and rebuilt it as a copy that they called the T or Tupolev 4. And this airplane appeared at a May Day parade in 1947. There is this B-29 flying overhead with Soviet markings on it. Well, it wasn't a B-29, it was the Tu-4, which is an exact copy of the B-29, except all the parts, the bolts, were all metric rather than English. Of course, by May 1947, the B-29 was obsolete, as was this airplane as well. Stalin drove a hard bargain for his participation in the war in the Pacific. At Yalta, he was able to get concessions from Roosevelt and from Churchill to allow him a totally free hand in Central and Eastern Europe, in return for which he would attack the Japanese within a particular period of time. Well, this happened on August 9th, 1945. It coincided with the second atom bomb on Nagasaki. And it was the Russian invasion of Manchuria, which occurred very rapidly after the Russian declaration of war, which fulfilled the Japanese army's greatest fear, that of a Russian attack in their rear. That was the straw that broke the camel's back, not just the atom bombs. It wasn't just the second bomb on Nagasaki, it was the Russian presence in the war. Post-Cold War rhetoric in the United States never gave the Russians any credit for any kind of achievement in Asia. And of course, the Russian performance against Japan was extremely hostile to the United States at the very end. Nonetheless, it was this invasion of Manchuria which convinced the Japanese army that the jig is up. The Navy had already been convinced. And August 14th, as we know, the Japanese agreed to surrender. What was the legacy of the Russo-Japanese and Japanese war? 80,000 Japanese dead, 47,000 from wounds, 33,000 from disease. The second time in history that a warring power had lost more men from injury than from disease. The first time was 1871. The Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War, using modern bacteriological techniques, had lost more men from casualties than from disease. Prior to that, particularly the American Civil War, any warring power, most of its casualties, most of its deaths were disease and not casualties. But that's not a huge number of people compared to American Civil War or later World War I figures. But for a nation that had never known military defeat, that had never known significant military reverses, this was a staggering amount. And of course, the Japanese are out of money, and they can't get any more. The Russians lost at least 70,000 men dead, mostly from disease. We don't know the exact figures. Neither the Russians nor the Japanese were particularly forthcoming about the casualties in the Russo-Japanese War, except we know they lost a lot, and this drawing made after the Battle of Mukden, which followed Tsushima, and which basically gave the Japanese essentially complete control over Manchuria, I think shows it pretty well, that it's the dead that represent the end result of the war. Of course, the Russian population at the time was about 200,000, and they lost 70,000, which by Russian standards was drop in the bucket. They could be and were indeed replaced. But in Russia, the dress rehearsal for the revolution of 1917 had been played. The United States and its president are now thrust on the center of the world stage, maybe willingly, maybe not unwillingly, but there the United States is, and there it will remain to the present day. The curtain has risen on what will become the 20th century, the most brutal, most bloody century in the history of the world. 20 million people will die as a result of World War I, 50 million as a result of World War II. It started with the Russo-Japanese War. It started with a surprise attack on the Russian fleet, February 8th, 1904, and lasted for the rest of the century. Thank you. Bill.
Well, would you speak to intelligence apparatus in those years?
The Japanese actually had pretty good intelligence, of course. They were helped. Remember, a quarter of the world is owned by Britain. They are Japanese allies. They don't like the Russians. The Russians don't like them either. One of Nicholas's favorite comments was that an Englishman is a Žid. An Englishman is a Jew, giving vent to his two favorite prejudices. So that the Japanese intelligence was helped by the British, who particularly had intelligence in Asia. But the Japanese were able, with help by the media, to instill in the Russians an incredible fear that they are everywhere. So that the Russians thought there were Japanese ships in the English Channel. They thought they saw Japanese ships off of the coast of Africa. They thought they saw Japanese ships off of Indochina. The Russian intelligence, meanwhile, is abysmal. It is almost non-existent. It gives Rozhetsvensky virtually no information whatsoever. The Japanese were well supplied by not only their own espionage, but by the world's press. The Japanese did, as I mentioned, secretly give a lot of money to the Russian revolutionaries. The Japanese helped bankroll the Russian Revolution of 1905. The revolution ended only because the war ended. If the Russians had continued the war, if the Treaty of Portsmouth had broken down or never been signed, and the Russians decided to continue the war, the revolution would have continued. And perhaps in 1905, the Tsar would have been overthrown rather than 1907.